Ukrainian president's visit to Washington, D.C. was supposed to confirm a change in the American stance toward Russia. Since the Trump-Putin meeting in Alaska a few weeks ago, the White House has been pressuring the Kremlin to agree to a ceasefire and start peace talks. Faced with a lack of results and an escalation of Russian attacks on Ukraine, Donald Trump's administration decided to toughen its rhetoric toward Moscow.
Now, if this war does not end, if there is no path to peace in the short term, then the United States, along with our allies, will take the steps necessary to impose costs on Russia for its continued aggression. If we must take this step, the U.S. War Department stands ready to do our part in ways that only the United States can do.
That's what the Pentagon chief said just 2 days ago. It seemed, therefore, that there would be no agreement and even an escalation, including the transfer of Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. However, yesterday's telephone conversation between U.S. President Trump and Putin changed everything.
We just had a call, as you know, with President Putin. I thought it was a very good call, so we'll talk about it maybe later. But it went very well.
How well is not yet known. What is known, however, is that two important meetings are to take place. The first between the Secretary of State and the Russian Foreign Minister. The second directly between Trump and Putin.
Pretty quick. Marco Rubio is going to be meeting with his counterpart, as you know, Lavrov, and they'll be meeting pretty soon. They're going to set up a time and a place very shortly. Maybe it's already set up. They've already spoken. And I thought it was a very good phone call. I thought very productive. But I'll be meeting with President Putin, and we'll make a determination. Tomorrow I'm meeting with President Zelensky, and I'll be telling him about the call.
According to preliminary arrangements, the meeting would take place in Budapest. However, it is not known what the Russians have put on the table. Much can be inferred from the meeting with the Ukrainian president. Just a few days ago, there was much talk about possible Tomahawk deliveries. Now, it seems that this issue will be suspended.
What do you think he's going to say? Please sell Tomahawks? Is he going to say, please sell those Tomahawks? I really appreciate it. I did actually say, would you mind if I gave a couple of thousand Tomahawks to your opposition? I did say that to him. I said it just that way. He didn't like the idea. He really didn't like the idea.
Was the idea of supplying Ukraine with long-range missiles real? It's not certain, but it could have made a huge impression on the Russians. Perhaps the Kremlin was actually frightened by the potential threat. Washington wants to end the war. If the Kremlin has made any real proposals that give hope for this, suspending sanctions or missile deliveries could be an opportunity for a ceasefire. On the other hand, similar hopes were pinned on the meeting in Alaska. There is an urgent need to increase pressure on Vladimir Putin to engage in serious peace talks. He responds to pressure. Yesterday's phone call also showed that it is a consequence of decisions made on the basis of announcements by the American side. Putin is playing his own game. It is difficult to imagine that he would simply be scared off by the Americans. This is certainly an attempt to play for time. Washington, D.C., on the other hand, has already learned how the Kremlin plays. So it seems that this time, the White House knows what is at stake. Another attempt at deception without concrete decisions will not work. And in Budapest, if the meeting takes place, concrete declarations will have to be made. Firstly, Mr. Zhuravlov, you are free. An important issue raised by the defense is the dire state of the justice system in Germany. The selection and appointment of judges, especially to the highest positions, is based on a decision by the government in Berlin. That is why the court's ruling was crucial. German politicians, starting with former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, were financially involved and profited from sitting on various boards of these companies. And none of the subsequent German governments addressed the issue of Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 in any way, thus accepting it. Can we be sure today that if a Ukrainian citizen were handed over to the German side, he would receive a fair trial? The defense argued that the courts in Germany are so politicized that judges are actually convicted for handing down judgments that are contrary to the will of those in power due to a lack of material immunity. Could a judge who would rule on this case not fear that if my client were acquitted, he would not face criminal liability because, for example, this ruling would violate Germany's interests? Furthermore, there are cases of infiltration of the political class or judges. Therefore, if Volodymyr Żurawlow's trial were to take place before the local courts, the verdict could be a mere formality. A few years ago, there was a very high-profile case of a judge who issued a ruling during the COVID-19 pandemic and was subjected to a real witch hunt. Namely, his apartment and office were searched, and all his computers were confiscated. He was then brought before a court, tried, and expelled from the profession. As the defendant pointed out, he would not have returned alive from Russia. Indeed, this case has an extremely emotional, political context. The court emphasized that the decision was based on a substantive rather than political considerations. The Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines were not blown up on German territory or in German territorial waters, but far from Germany, near the Danish island of Bornholm, and most importantly, in international waters. The case should therefore be assessed in the light of international law, which should take precedence over German law. Although the state of justice in Germany leaves much to be desired, the government in Berlin does not suffer any consequences for this. At the same time, Brussels imposes financial penalties on other European Union countries, in accordance with the principle of money for the rule of law. The European Commission blocked money from the National Recovery Plan and other funds to influence political decisions in individual countries. The Warsaw Court's ruling has shaken the media in Germany. In their narrative, they are supporting the Kremlin's propaganda. They call the destruction of Russian infrastructure sabotage. Indirectly by purchasing gas from Russia and transferring billions of euros during this full-scale military aggression and acts of genocide committed by Russia against the Ukrainian civilian population, which were already known to the German side before this event, the German state co-financed this aggression. Germany's cooperation with Russia went far beyond the economic context. The Polish court also clearly blames the Germans for the construction of this infrastructure. Under 2 Nord Stream agreements, approximately 110 billion cubic meters of gas per year were to be delivered to Germany. This is enough to meet the needs of the largest economies in Europe. That is why both German and Russian public opinion are now demanding that those responsible be held accountable. However, it is incomprehensible why it was the Polish prosecutor's office, specifically the district prosecutor's office in Warsaw, that referred the case for the extradition of Volodymyr Żurawlow to the court at the request of Germany. There is no doubt that Polish politicians had or could have had an influence on the case of Volodymyr Żurawlow. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk did not make any decisions regarding a possible abolition. In turn, politicians from the ruling coalition blocked the opposition's actions in this matter. Unfortunately, the Polish prosecutor's office zealously carried out what Germany wanted. Based on what we hear was a short A4 sheet of paper. They detained this man, conducted searches, and sent some items to Germany. This information was reported in the media. They filed a motion for arrest, and the court granted it. There are mistakes here, and I think it must also be clarified who exactly was responsible for this, because it exposed the Polish state to embarrassment. They acted as if they wanted to extradite this man. The justice system under Waldemar Żurek led to a situation in which a Ukrainian was tried in Poland for destroying Russian infrastructure. This is how he himself commented on the case. How did you experience this whole period of the arrest, but also the raid by the services, including the German services in Poland before that? It was completely difficult. I had to deal with it somehow, because I have a family, I have children. The Nord Stream gas pipeline was over 1,200 kilometers long. For years, the Kremlin's long arm reached directly into the wallets of Europeans, all with Berlin's consent. The agreement between the two countries was signed against the interests of Germany's allies in the European Union and NATO, disregarding the opposition of the United States. Under this agreement, Russia gained the ability to use energy as leverage, as well as billions of euros, which emboldened its imperial ambitions. When the Israeli army withdrew from the Gaza Strip and Hamas terrorists came out of their hiding places onto the streets, the first thing they did was publicly execute those who opposed their rule. This is how these ruthless Palestinian terrorists behave, and they have just received a very serious warning from Donald Trump. If Hamas continues to kill people in Gaza, which was not the deal, we will have no choice but to go in and kill them. Thank you for your attention to this matter.
Well, I'm looking at what's happening, and that wasn't the deal that was made, and we'll see what happens. It's calmed down. It's a tough neighborhood. We know that. We have a commitment from them, and I assume they're going to honor that commitment. I hope they do.
Donald Trump sets clear conditions for terrorists. They must surrender their weapons and power because their bloody rule in the region is coming to an end. They can do so amicably or feel the meaning of Donald Trump's words on their own skin. Hamas is a brutal terrorist organization supported by a rather weakened Iran. And what we are now seeing, fresh in this first phase of the implementation of this peace agreement, which is a breakthrough, is an attempt by Hamas to forcefully save its position among the Palestinian population in Gaza. And this is being done with terrorist methods. The agreement provides for the demilitarization of Hamas, so Trump's recent threat against Hamas may not come as much of a surprise in itself. Hamas is a criminal organization that spreads terror under the guise of political and ideological goals. It uses the residents of the Gaza Strip, including women and children, as human shields to protect itself from Israeli retaliation. In addition to brute force, its weapon is also powerful indoctrination. Hamas terrorists have already begun actions aimed at punishing those residents of the Gaza Strip who did not help the terrorists, who supported Israel or remained neutral for one simple reason: only through policy of fear, only through policy of terror, can Hamas continue to function in the Gaza Strip and continue to prepare for further attacks on Israel. We are talking here about torture and the murder of civilians, planting bombs and other atrocities that are difficult for us to imagine. When Hamas militants invaded Israeli territory more than 2 years ago, they cold-bloodedly murdered residents of border homes. They kidnapped innocent people, murdered men, raped women and children, and took hostages, whom they held for over 2 years in inhumane conditions. Tal Shaham spent 505 days in Hamas captivity. He was beaten, tortured, and starved. The terrorists abused him physically and mentally.
Ways to torture us psychologically and physically. So, for example, they entered a few times and told us that one of us need to die, and we can choose who it will be. Or they want to shoot one of us, and we need to choose.
Palestinian criminals also showed no mercy to the kidnapped women, whom they treated with particular cruelty. I remember how they pointed their guns at me and how they molested me. I remember my screams in the darkness. I went through hell in Hamas captivity. I was imprisoned, starved. My bones were broken. I will never forget that fear and pain. But Hamas's barbaric actions do not end there.
Hamas
uses its own people as human shields, attacks humanitarian convoys intended for civilians, for the Palestinian population, and thus effectively robs its own people, depriving them of food and increasing their hardship, especially the scourge of hunger, which has affected at least part of the Gaza Strip. Later, terrorists use photos of destroyed Gaza and starving people in their propaganda materials on the internet. But there is hope that Donald Trump's peace plan will also end the terror of Hamas. which has brought misery to the inhabitants of the Gaza Strip.